and put together a video, and yeah.
Mm.
And I met with a realtor because my husband and I are buying a house because he and I have a husband.
So many things have changed.
So many things have changed. Yeah.
Thank you for being here, more, and congratulations on the wedding and trip and all the things.
All the things. All great.
So I want to just say that I just started recording. So for those of you many people will watch this. Some people, that's the way they interact with my tribe. They can't always attend these conversations. They might forward questions, and then they will listen later. So I just want to acknowledge that. I just started the recording. We had Anna introduce herself, Megan, Leslie, Moore, and Ebony. If you would introduce yourself, and we'll jump right in. And you're on mute, I think. Here, I got you.
Okay. I'm Ebony, and I'm on here to get back connected to the yoga community.
Nice. So there's been like a missing there or something.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Well, the cool thing about doing things like this, it's like a yoga class or a conversation like this, is once you take that action to move forward, just like there you are. You don't have to like work on it. You're here. You're in the community fully, 100%. So thank you for being here. Yes,
thanks for having me.
And I just mentioned a moment ago the connections. It's just amazing that I said a few of you have done teacher training. Megan, you're going to be up to teacher training, and Anna. This is also really exciting because Anna and I and Christina had our like second official Mind Tribes team meeting, and Anna is going to be taking over the leadership of the Declare and Deliver program. It's a virtual coaching program that we do. And I want to acknowledge that because, Ebony, you're a coach in the program, participant in the program. Leslie, same, you're a participant in the program. So I like to acknowledge that. It's nice to see. And to give you a bigger picture of what we do, because, even thinking of you more, like we haven't really sat down and had a conversation about what it is we do and how it's changed. And so we do weekend programs. We did the program that we did this weekend called Asana Deep Dive. And we go around the country and do that now. So we go to LA. We're working on Seattle to visit Candace, one of our friends there. Chicago is coming up. If those of you who did Declare and Deliver remember Jesus from Chicago, he's a friend that used to live in Houston. He and his partner moved to Chicago and opened a studio. And we're working on a project there and a number of other places. But we have that, the virtual coaching program, obviously our teacher training. And then the thing that really, like, if I want to say the glue that pulls it all together is my tribe. And it's been, I see, like you said, more, it's like you see people online and like, yeah, I kind of know what they're up to. And I've missed just connecting with people and having conversations. Like Leslie and I sat down a week ago and had a one-on-one conversation. And I'm like, there's so many people now in the world that I just want to sit down and have like a geeky anatomy conversation with, or share a sequence, or, connect with if they need some support or I need some support. And my tribe is really like the glue that's starting to like pull that world together so we can stay connected. It's like next best thing to being face to face with somebody in our world. So let's just jump right in. And the way I'm going to present this is, it is more of a, it might occur as more of a lecture at the beginning, but I would prefer actually if you stop me. So if you hear something that, like, what is that, or hold up, or say that again, anything like that, please do stop me. And I'll share a little bit more, and then I'm going to ask some questions of you. And we also have some questions that kind of solicited to you, a few of you through text, and some other people sent me some questions. So I want to make sure I get to your questions. And then any questions that you generate through the conversation today too, I want to get through those. And the lay of the land basically is, I'm going to share this structure with you. I don't know if this is backwards or not. And my lighting here is kind of funky for those of you who can see. So I'll be sure to work on that for next time. But there's like this weird glare going on, right? So I'll be sure to like explain what all this means. So this is a diagram that, when you look at the nature of the hips, talking about hips tonight. When you look at the nature of the hips, there's so much going on. And I even like to describe both the structures and the physical structures and the energetics of the hips as like this almost like, think of the Grand Canyon. There's like so many crevices and open spaces and dark spaces and like so many areas that are unexplored. So we'll cover the bones-based anatomy. I'm getting a text from somebody here that's trying to get into the workshop. So let me just send them a quick message here. Okay, we'll see if that works. So we'll cover bones-based anatomy, some of the muscular or myofascial structures, and then some of the issues that can arise. And the thing that the reason why I'm including this is it's been a really good grounding source for me in terms of getting all the things that can happen to the hip. And it's not exactly like, it's not always an exact fit, but how many of you are dealing, I know Anna and Megan, you shared just like generally tight in my hips, right? But how many of you are dealing with or have students who are dealing with certain issues in the hip, right? So it's not a diagnostic. And in fact, the majority of the work that we do is not diagnostic work. So I would say almost exclusively, we never diagnose anybody. We might explore a movement pattern, explore some issue that someone's dealing with. And based on, after a while, when you're teaching a number of people, you'll start to see patterns that arise and patterns based on certain age blocks. Older, beyond 40, you start to look at osteoporosis. And, hip replacements in general, it's amazing how it's moving back in age. So people who used to get hip replacements at 60, they're getting them at 40 now. So there's this bigger inquiry of, here's how I like to ground myself initially, is look at and understand how the hip breaks down or how the hip degenerates. Not talking about like natural aging, but it could be a number of different abnormalities or exposure to something that causes the hip to break down. Okay, so let's look at this and just get grounded in this first. We'll see if I can actually just shift it a little. I don't know if that's going to make a big difference, but can everyone see this? Kind of not. Yeah. And I'm gonna explain what each section is too. So we have this central circle, the orange circle, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that are attached to it, 6 circles that are attached to that bigger circle. And at the center of everything, there's this acronym FAI. FAI. And I'm using that as kind of the center of everything, and then getting the many different types of connections. So it could all be interlinked. So FAI is femoral acetabular impingement. And the language in it, and I'll just turn this back for a moment, the language of it is important and it is helpful. So acetabulum, does anyone know what the acetabulum is? So let me get this guy. Anyone? Acetabulum? Megan? Leslie? I know Leslie, you said you're not feeling too well, so. Okay, so if we look at the hip, here's anterior, and these are some muscular structures. We'll talk about those a little later. But if you look at the anterior hip, but then the hip essentially, is a ball and socket here. You see this? So we have femur, greater trochanter, there's lesser trochanter on the posterior aspect, and then neck of the femur is that thinner space, and then it's a ball and socket joint. So we have head of the femur, and then the space that the head of the femur fits into, the cup of the hip, is called the acetabulum. And in terms of the Latin word acetabulum, it means it's a cup to denote what the Greeks and the Romans would use for holding vinegar or holding wine. So if you think about the hip and all of the synovial fluid, there's many different types of fluids and soft structures of the hip. It's like you want that that lubrication of the joint. So there's this symbolism of cup and ball and socket. So there's rotation in many different directions that's available. So acetabulum. And this isn't up here, but if you have you ever heard of hip dysplasia? Okay, what's hip dysplasia? I might ask you what, and you're like, I don't know, or this is what I think it is, or any ideas?
I don't know what it is, but I know that my basset hound is at risk for it.
Oh,
And
good. Okay.
that she has, so basset hounds have very long spines, obviously. So maybe so I don't know, but yeah.
So think of the
I
cup.
do know that if you have more weight, like if you're overweight, then you're at higher risk for developing it.
Yeah, so sorry to hear about your dog.
No, she's not overweight, so she's fine.
Sorry about the genetic predisposition to hip
of
dysplasia.
basset hounds to get that.
Now, the way that I like to visualize it is think of that acetabulum, the cup. Instead of it being a cup, it's more like a plate. So it's very open, and then you can have hip dysplasia. The hip can be set differently and be unstable because of that. But then you can also have displacement. So the hip can actually move, the ball and socket can move. And we'll look at some of the structural pieces about, you can actually predict if someone has really loose fascia is connective tissue, and ligament structure, and to some degree tendon structure. If it's hypermobile, you can start to predict the different issues with both, not so much dysplasia, but displacement when it moves out of the socket, which can be extremely painful. And some people, they actually get into this thing where it can pop out and pop back in, which is very unsettling and painful. I've had it happen a couple times, very minor, but it's just like a little, I don't know if you've ever had this, but it in my mind, I hear it as bloop, bloop. And I go like, whoa, something happened, but it was just the hip was setting. So let's just go, I'm going to come back to this. I'm sticking with femoral acetabular impingement. So if you think of it, it's the femur and the acetabulum. So there's a rim, I'll go back to the little thing here. So there's a rim of acetabulum, and that rim also has so think of it like the circular structure. It has about 170 degrees of that is the labrum, and the labral tears occur at that area. So femoral acetabular, it's good to know the words, the femur and the acetabulum, they will bump up against, they'll be impinged against one another. So what can often happen, it's one of the many things that can happen, is you have impingement. Let's say someone does, just put it more into anatomy terms. Let's say someone does hip flexion, uttanasana, the forward fold, and they do forward fold, and there's this impingement that happens at the superior anterior aspect of the, you're like, what? I'm going to say a lot of words too, and I'll back up. So if you're like, hold up, wait, say that again. Superior is just the top, anterior is just the front. And let's say someone does a forward fold, and this leg bone, the femur, the head of the femur, and maybe even the neck of the femur starts jamming against the acetabulum. And if it jams enough, there can be a rupture. It's either the labrum detaches from the bone itself, or it tears in between the bone and there's some space in the middle that will tear a little bit. And because this area is it has less vascular structures. You might not even feel it. So you have this kind of impingement, and think about it as, doing half moon. So you're one leg up and one leg down, and you have the head of the femur like this, the acetabulum like this, and there's a jamming that goes on. Now, the other thing about yoga is that unlike sports like football or even basketball, skiing to some degree, it's more a slow acting force. So you're standing there and there's this slow acting force down on the head and the neck of the femur. And it's unlike acute. Acute forces generate high levels of force and tension in the hip. So I'm just kind of repeating over and over and over. Femoral acetabular impingement is when there's a compression of the joint of the hip over time. So if you practice in a way that you take an enormous amount of load on the hip, over time, you could expose yourself to things like labral tear. And then, so here's the way of looking at, well, what do we do about that? If I'm jamming the hip, the thing that you want to do is decompress the hip. How do you all think you decompress the hip? It's kind of a trick question. What do you think?
Sorry, Eric's making me tea. I don't know. I'm not trying to talk.
No, you're fine. And I'm listening in the background. I'm also messaging one of the participants who's trying to get in. Anna, what do you think?
I feel like that's funny. I feel like it is strengthening the outer hip to decompress.
That's secondary.
Okay.
Okay, so it's both an easy. Leslie, do you want to say something?
Oh, I would think it maybe just like releasing the fascia, or it's just weakening the fascia and then strengthening the outer hip.
Yes, that's it. So and I'm going to add one little piece of minutia to that. So think of, here's the way to resolve this. So we have, and this is a good way of looking at how to address injury in general is, and let me use the shoulder as another example, because sometimes it helps to pull away from the thing you're looking at. Because when you get like blinders on and you're looking at something like a problem, like the puzzle that I'm working on out there, and it's just driving me crazy, and I need to stand up and walk away from the puzzle and come back, and maybe I can figure out these totem poles, right? Sometimes helps to look at other joints in the body. So if I have a problem at the front of my shoulder, the looking and the listening starts to be, okay, what's the opposing action that I want to do to resolve the issue? So in that instance, so let me say that again. What's the opposing action that will resolve the issue? So it's literally looking at, how do I reverse this? So with the shoulder, just generally speaking, if I have an issue on the front side of my shoulder where that's, if you want to correlate it at all, it's like you can have impingement at the acromion process, which is like a hood. I can show you on this guy later, but it's like a hood of the shoulder blade. And then you have the ball and socket joint of the shoulder, which is in some ways similar to the girdle of the pelvis. And as you do something like an upward facing dog, right? Especially if the shoulder is deep set, then you can impinge and cause rotator cuff injuries. So if I have an issue on the front of the shoulder, I'll literally start to look at the back of the shoulder and engage structures on the back of the shoulder. So if I walk backwards in that thinking into the hip, there's kind of a 3-step approach. Could be more, could be less, depending on the issue. But if I have hip, right, ball and socket, compression of the hip, there's like this jamming of the hip. What I want to do first and foremost is try to decompress the hip. So now I'm exaggerating. The hip will not do this. The ball and socket, you don't want it to be displaced. But if I put my hand, if I'm sitting in Siddhasana, like a meditation seat, and I'm going to put some videos on both on our Facebook page and send them to you through the newsletter. So you'll get some examples of this in action and movement. If I put my hand on my inner thigh, my thumb on my inner thigh, and I lean away and I start to press down on my thigh, and then I can even kind of cycle in and out of this, I can start to decompress the hip. Then the second thing, just going forward with what Leslie was saying, is you want to loosen the fascia first. Okay, so loosening the fascia, the way the connective tissue is made, it's made in sheets. So think of it like a matrix, like this, right? And literally, if you're not mobile, that's why we wake up in the morning and you do like that kind of big stretch. If you're not mobile, if you're stationary or sedentary, all of that fascia starts to dehydrate and become stiff. So as soon as you start moving it around, it becomes more hydrated, more lubricated, and there are energetics related to that as well. So, trauma can start to release, breath is affected. There's all these different impacts of just move it around, loosen it, move it in all different directions. And then the third thing is stabilize. So in this case, depending on, Leslie, I like your question about that external rotation thing, because that's usually with the problem with people is these are my femurs and my femurs roll inward because outer hip is weak. So I'll go back, repeat, decompress the hip. And when you decompress the hip, there's a reverse suction. So when you pull the head of the femur gently away from the acetabulum, it encourages synovial fluid to flow into the hip joint. And just with synovial fluid, it also doesn't grind on the cartilage that's inside of the actual acetabulum. Some people have that where there's no cartilage left and the hip will grind and literally start shaving away. The head of the femur starts shaving away. And you have to usually, at that point, get a hip replacement. So decompress like this, and then mobilize, move it around in all these different directions, and finally strengthen the hip. And when I say strengthen the hip, generally, I'm going to speak generally, here's what I mean. You have glute maximus over top of this, so there's one missing here. Glute medius is this red one. And then you have glute minimus, which is underneath the yellow one you see here. Okay, this muscle here, glute medius, is pretty key to decompressing the hip. Because if we think of, and I'm going to take a pause here in a moment just so we can come up for air. But if you think of issues happening at the inside of the hip, if there's all this tension and pressure and tightness, it's bearing down on the neck of the femur. So if I have issues on the front of the hip, like my shoulder, I want to look at the back of the hip and see what I can do to strengthen that to release the front of the hip. Okay, so let me pause. Let me get some tea. And I want to know from you, what are you hearing in this conversation? / lecture. It's basically a lecture. I get that. What are you hearing?
I'm hearing that it pretty typically, anything that you're trying to probably decompress or work with starts with loosening the connective tissue that surrounds it. Because how are you going to start to work with it unless things are opening up?
Exactly. So side question, in addition to mobilizing the hip, like literally moving it in many different directions, so movement diversity. In addition to that, what are some ways to mobilize the fascia of the hip?
Well, we're talking about cycling. Is that what you mean?
So that's like the movement piece. But if you take out movement, right? Because if you look, we're moving, depending on your lifestyle, you're moving either quite a bit or not at all, or not a lot, I should say.
Yes.
And like we're driving a lot, we're sitting a lot. Teachers, I know you're standing probably quite a bit, moving around. And it's generally a pretty linear, immobile process of moving. So if you go, but I do practice yoga, and you're on the mat, what percentage of the time of your life are you on the mat? Or say in a week, are you on the mat? Hi, Fanya. We see you.
Yay.
Well, I see a picture of you. I know you're here. Yeah. So what percentage do you think you're on your mat?
Oh my gosh. Whatever, like 6-ish hours a week is.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I don't know in percentage.
If you just do that small percentage, if you just do that, that's good. It's great. It's probably more than most do.
Yeah.
Or just for Fanya, you coming in, we're asking the question, what other ways can you start to address tightness in the fascia? Connective tissue. Any ideas?
So I was thinking through breathing. Is that considered movement?
That's considered movement.
Oh.
So,
Oh.
Yeah. And it's funny because, that's really getting the distinction of movement paradigm versus exercise paradigm. Because when you say breathing, you're like, that's not movement, or that's not exercise. It's like, well, it depends, right? It is movement. But if you take the movement piece out, what other ways can you address? I'll just give you a couple. Number one, your stress level. Your fascia responds directly to your stress. And I'm thinking when people are like, oh, your stress is in your hips, like stretch it out, get into the hips, like get into that like untapped emotion. That could be said for any part of the body actually. So it's, yes, stress is held in your hips and in your shoulders and in your heart and in your throat and your ankle. So it depends on your genetic set. And diet. So if you have a vitamin deficiency, you might have excess tightness in the hips, or again, certain areas of the body. Because when you say hips and fascia, you can't discount that the tightness in the hip could be coming from an instability in the ankle. That's the nature of fascia. It's interconnected all throughout the body. And things can reference to the hips. So the other one is genetics. Genetics is a big piece. So some people are, it's like stira sukha. Some people are hypermobile and some of them are like way immobile. And that's just genetically, it's like, some people aren't going to get their foot behind their head and life's going to be okay. Life's going to be great. Nothing really happens when you put your foot behind your head, by the way. Maybe Instagram pic. Maybe that's it. I don't know. That's it. So what other questions? What else are you getting so far from this conversation?
Dan, just really quickly on that, drinking more water?
Yes. Yeah. Drinking water. Hydration level is important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a big one that I missed.
Hey everyone, Fanya here.
Hi, Fanya.
Or actually, hold on. Let me put my video on. I'm just like
Hey.
1,000 things as usual.
You're good.
I'm thinking about like not the stagnant, I'm not gonna say stagnant, like still movement patterns. That's something that is I've been super aware of lately, especially with her, right? I always carry her on my right. So the whole right side of my body feels tight, even though it's actually longer. So I've been trying to carry her on the left side. And then when I'm driving and stuff, those doing little tweaks in our everyday movement, like instead of driving like this, driving like that, so that I'm stretching out my wrists. That's how I start to kind of, turn it inside out. What are you doing? Yeah.
Tanya, you're reminding me of when I was at House of Yoga this weekend. We were leading a program there, this yoga studio in Pennsylvania. So we were leading a program there, and I was having a conversation with a girl, and I was like, you kind of look like a fighter. And she's like, I do Muay Thai. And Muay Thai fighters tend to lead, depending on whether right or left-handed. Most people are right-handed, so they lead with the left hand and then will have a kick with the right. Yeah. And there's a lot of different studies, research to show that people who are one side dominant in sports, kicking sports especially, soccer, martial arts, Muay Thai, things like that, they can cause an imbalance in the psoas muscle. We'll get into that also in a moment, but they'll cause this imbalance in the psoas muscle, and it causes the hips to then be displaced like so. And it might even show in one shoulder going up or one shoulder going down. So you think, oh, my shoulder. But if you look at the structure of the myofascia down the hip, like you're saying, it's like holding the baby on one side, trains an imbalance in the body. And this is kind of going beyond the focus of what we're doing here. But if you constantly have that imbalance in the tension or the tensegrity of the body, then you have also issues that can arise in the organs. So there's an imbalance in your organ's ability to be able to function properly. And that's when you can kind of go in the direction of traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurveda or something to that effect. Okay, so any other questions right now? Okay, so let's go back. Just gonna kind of cycle around and go back to this diagram. So we have and I've been hanging in the center of this for now, just to kind of get that femoral acetabular impingement. And then I'll give you just a general sense of all of the other interconnected issues that could arise. One is labral tears. We talked about that. So if you have femoral acetabular impingement, you might have labral tears that arise. I just read a comprehensive review of labral tears. So it's like big picture view of all the things that can go wrong with labrum. And it's interesting that most people, so they did research on cadavers and found that, and in other studies also, that found that most people have labral tears, yet they're undiagnosed. So you can actually have some dull pain or no pain and have a tear and not ever get it diagnosed. And it was much, much higher incidence than people realized. So that one's really interesting. So this is, we mentioned it's the structure around the acetabulum, and it helps with a couple things. It helps with, it creates depth of the socket of the hip because it actually wraps. It's more of like a collagen fibrous structure that wraps. It creates stability, so it literally holds the head of the femur in place, and it creates lubrication, so it helps with the gliding and the sliding of the hip. And here's the way I like to think about this structure, is that it's a shock absorber for the hip. So in that technical paper that I was reading, it talks about doing research on people who have had that structure removed. And what increases by 92%, what increases is pressure or like compression in the hip. So there's some element of, it does absorb an enormous amount of shock from the hip. And so I'm just going to move forward. We've talked a little bit about that already. We have abnormal mechanics. So there could be some structural things that are just your unique set. We have tendinopathy. It's this one over here, tendinopathy, and ligament sprain, so tendon ligament. One of the things that I was looking up was you can have calcium deposits in the tendons that cause these like little bulbs, or cause in general immobility. So if you don't cycle the fascia, if you don't move and heat up the fascia, all of that can start to bear down. And this is an important point, I think, for asana practitioners who stay in a pose, hold a pose. Some of the ones that I see are, I'll just use one example, is crescent lunge, the way it's taught. Typically, crescent lunge was Anjaneyasana, and that's with back knee down, both feet either straight ahead, back toe tucked, right? And then the way we do a full crescent lunge now is a bit of a newer innovation as far as yoga asana. And that one, if you're holding it, what happens is the myofascia and the other connective tissues can start to clamp down. So I've even heard in certain practices where a teacher will say, hug the muscle into the bone, and then they hold it for because it also creates this really interesting, euphoric, energetic feeling when you're in a pose and you're holding it for a long time. But what the body does when you're in that position for potentially too long, depending on your level of experience, what can happen is all of those soft tissues will clamp on the bone. And at any point in time when you're in a practice, what I encourage is, instead of it clamping, is encourage the muscle lengthening. And then if you even do this, we call it cycling, or depending on what community we're in, we call it mindful fidgeting. So if you're in a crescent lunge, let's say, boom, you're in crescent lunge and you're stiff, or if you're a teacher and you see your students' faces start to stiffen and their jaw, this little muscle, the masseter muscle in their jaw starts firing, they're going into fight or flight. When the body goes into fight or flight, the muscles tend to clamp, because you're either freezing, getting ready to run, or you're going to crumble. So that tendon, ligament, sprain thing too, that's some issues with that particular one. This is interesting. This is not mine. I don't have the reference for it right now, but it also includes etc. And I just thought it was funny that whenever you're talking about the hip especially, you're there's almost, even in the research, there's this who the hell knows kind of approach. And they're finding out more and more and more about things that they thought were correct that aren't correct, and new things they're discovering about the energetics of the hip. The other area that's a big one for a lot of practitioners, women especially, is osteoarthritis or osteoporosis. And this one becomes an issue with the hip. So we talked about, let me go here. So we have head of the femur, neck of the femur, greater trochanter, lesser trochanter. What can happen is if there's weakness in the bone is so we have the femur, and then we have the neck of the femur, and then the ball of the femur up here. What happens is there's a bit of a Roman arch thing happening with the femur. And over time, if you have a tremendous amount of pressure on the front of the hip, the anterior portion of the hip, say because of the fan of the hip being weak, or maybe just excess tightness, that pressure on the front of the hip, it bears down on the femoral head. And over time, have you ever seen people, or maybe this is you, when you sit in Baddha Konasana with your feet together and your knees go way up? And then people think I got to push my knees down. And that pushing the knees down actually over time causes the tissues to resist and pull back, and you become more immobile. So over time, if all of your tendons and all of the myofascia is tense and pulling down, what happens is this. So the bone will actually deform. And there's laminate in the bone that it's designed to stack, kind of like Roman arches, like bricks. And if that stack gets pulled here, then the muscle or the bone can actually shear. So what happens is, you have osteoporosis or early onset of osteoporosis, you fall down and break your hip, but what actually happened is you broke your hip and then you fell down. And then the other thing that I've learned nutrition wise is MK4 is a good vitamin to supplement for bone density. And then the other thing for bone density is putting force load pressure on the bone itself. You put force load pressure on the bone, it stimulates osteoblasts, which create the remodeling of bone, sending out of old bone material and degeneration of new bone material. And that is a counter to osteoporosis. Okay,
Dan, can you break down what you just said? I don't understand that. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. And that's what I want you to do. I'm just going to go. And if y'all are like, wait, what did he say? Stop me.
Okay, I'm stopping you.
Good, thank you. So let's say you have femur, right? And if I miss anything too, go, no, what about this? Okay, so you have the femur, largest bone in the body. Okay, and to build bone density, it's, well, you can look at nutrition. So what I mean by nutrition is obviously whole foods, hydration, all of these like general things of building just general nutrition. But then there's also MK4 is a nutrient that you can get it in pill form. There's another one too. Leslie, do you remember what the other one is? I know you're kind of knowledgeable about this. MK4.
I don't. No, I was thinking MK4, but no, I don't remember the other.
Okay. That nutrition-wise, MK4 is great, but then also if you think about, and there's certain postures that we can teach where you load the bone. So you put a pressure on the bone. Think the half moon example. So you're on one leg, and in this case, you're putting a force load pressure on the bone, and that force load pressure will start to encourage the process of bone regeneration. So you have osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And I'm not going to go into, I'm not even as knowledgeable about the biomechanics of it or the biochemistry, but it's this process that gets stimulated that for many people lies dormant because they're not putting really a force load pressure on the bones in a way, or the force load pressure is so much that the other joints aren't strong and can't handle the compression that's happening, say, in the hip, for example. Okay, so it's like movement, and movement is it. Like when we say shift your weight back into your heels, automatically that starts to put more of a subtle force load pressure in the bone itself. So it's kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier. It's like, how do we address this? Starts with an E. I got that, Leslie. I'll look for it. If there's anything I'm missing, I'll see if I can send it forward to the group. So movement is it. Movement is actually our number one core value for Mind Tribes. Can we move things? Nutrition, mobility. So we're kind of going back to that method again, right? Mobilize first, loosen the connective tissue. It's going to take pressure off of the hip joint. So then you know you're not going to have that deformation, hopefully, of the bone. Did that answer your question more or start to kind of put more light on it? Okay, cool. And it's, all of this material, it's like, I say put light on it, like shining a light, and you like shine a light on something and then you're like, oh, I didn't even see that. What is that? And you go to something else and you just realize there's so much information. So I just let go of everything and go, what's one thing that I want to like get really curious about and study? Now, other pieces are hip pain. And I know that's super general, but I like including that in this diagram because hip pain is one of the number one indicators of whether or not you can modify, adjust, adapt your practice. So there's all types of different hip pain. There's pain in clicking, pain in different front, back, side of the hip. A lot of people have a lot of anterior hip pain, say in flexion. Is there anyone here who has any hip pain?
Dan, I think I mentioned to you before the call that I do have, it's always triggered by how I'm sleeping as well as when I'm driving, but I do have in my right hip, outer hip, pain that goes down to my knee oftentimes. So that whole line sometimes is affected. And I'm not quite sure what triggers it, but I do try to be mindful about those two things, and it seems to help.
Yeah, I have, for your question, for me, this is just helpful to have the other people hear it again. For me, I have external hip rotation of my hip. I have external rotation of my hip that sometimes I can feel it down to my right knee. I found that I'm constantly having to correct how I sleep on my back and wanting to draw the leg up. And also the way that I have my leg positioned when I drive impacts me. And Anna, I thought of your question about the driving piece. So a good way of assessing just for yourself is, it's like some people go, don't diagnose, but you've got to look at, is your practice moving in the direction of pain-free or no pain? And if you're progressively moving in the direction of more pain, do not ignore the pain. Adapt your movement. If the pain doesn't diminish or doesn't, like there's no resolution to that, then consult somebody. Maybe it's ask your teacher. I mean, we can be here as a resource. Then it could also be ask a professional, ask a PT. Many things can be worked out with what we call, essentially it's PT, but it's like you can do things to resolve some of the issues before you have to consider something like surgery or some bigger item. Okay, so to answer your question, and I'm kind of moving around a little bit, but here's an approach. Look at, first and foremost, do I have pain in my joint? If you have pain in the joint, ever stop. Okay, so if you feel, Leslie, do you feel any pain in the socket or in the actual joint of the knee?
No, in the knee actually, yes, but not so much in the hip.
Yeah. Anything in the low back?
No. Mm-mm.
Okay. And just to kind of break down my process for when you're listening to your people, or like when you're kind of looking at your own movement, your own body, it's helpful to look at adjacent joints. So here's what I mean by that. I'm like isolating, where's the pain? The pain might not be the issue though. So I go hip, okay, hip, what are the two adjacent joints to the hip? This will be a question for you all. What are the two primary joints that are adjacent to the hip?
The femur and the knee.
Say it again. Did you say the knee?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's distal, right? Like down the knee, down the leg. It's the knee. That's the next closest joint to the hip. What's superior to that? Shoulder? No, it's too high. But what's interesting about fascia more is that it could be the shoulder. It could be. So I might expand my view and go like, let's look up there. But generally I start with looking at adjacent joints. So what's the next primary joint? It's kind of a trick question. I don't know if I want to say trick question. It's a little more, it's more complex.
Is it the other hip joint, like the other side?
No.
No.
It might be, but generally no. So the next one is
the ankle.
Say it again.
The ankle.
Well, that's
I guess
farther
it's not
down.
the ankle. Now it's further down. Yeah.
What's superior? What's above the hip joint? What major joints? This is why it's a bit of a trick question. When you hear it, you'll be like, "Oh, makes total sense." Maybe.
Dan, I'm thinking
Yeah.
the spine.
The spine. Yeah. So it could be sacroiliac joint. So that's the joint in between. And I acknowledge I haven't really covered the bony structures yet, but this is a good one to know. Is and the verbiage. This is why anatomy is so important, I think, because the verbiage gives you the answer. So you have sacrum, right? Sacrum coccyx is under here. It's part of the spine. It's the fused part of the spine. And then we have two kind of general parts on the back of the pelvis. Really, we have, these are ischial tuberosities down here. So this is the ischium, the lower section, and then the ilium, which is the higher section. So SI, sacroiliac, we have sacrum and the ilium, and the joint just between those two. Have you ever had pain there? I've had pain here before. Sacroiliac joint pain. People who do a lot of creative flow and don't have a good source of foundation in their feet, they can experience a lot of, because there's like super twisting and it gets dance flowy, they can experience some pain here because there's an instability. So it could be there, but that's more so caused by like twisting. And I'm saying the next joint is lumbar spine. And that's where, I mean, it's one of the top three leading areas of injury in yoga. Because what tends to happen is people don't maintain the normal lordotic curve of the spine, that like kind of that whoosh curve here. So that's the next place I would look. And I asked Leslie, do you have any low back pain? No, nothing there. So then I know there's something going on with this side. Okay, so because she has external rotation. External rotation is if you look at the femur bone and it goes open, then there could be some imbalance of, Leslie, would you say the fan of your hip is pretty strong?
I don't know where that is, the fan of my hip.
Yeah, so think of the hip like see how it's almost like a fan here? Oh, you're not on video, are you? So the fan of the hip, if you look at, even you can feel, everyone do this, feel your hip bone on the side. Put your thumb on the top of your hip bone, and then use your four fingers to palpate the outer part of your hip. Like there's like a crevice there. That's the fan of your hip. That's part of it. So what muscles do we already know are in that area?
Yeah.
Say it again.
Yeah, I would say my glutes are not that strong. No, I would say if that's the area you're referring to.
Yeah. So it could be, you still have external rotation of the femur, yeah?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So it's looking at, you might have overactive, some of the deeper muscles of the hip, obturators, for example, could be tighter. And you could also have, are you lax on the inner thigh?
Yeah.
So
I noticed this the other day. Yeah.
Okay. So, people tend, so y'all, is everyone tracking? Is anyone not tracking? You're like, wait, where are we right now? Oh, good. Yeah. To have that anatomy. Here's another resource, actually. I use it all the time. It's an app on my phone. You have to pay for it. I forget how much it is. Not that much. It's called Essential Anatomy 5. And it opens up and you can look at that and then watch. It's pretty cool. You can add bone, you can add muscle structures, you can add like lymphatic structures. It's super cool. And you can zoom out and fade things and look all different directions. So that's another resource if you're looking for something that you want to have on hand with you. Say if you're teaching a class and you're like, what muscle is that?
What's the name of that?
It's Essential Anatomy. I don't know if there's an updated version. I have version number 5. Essential Anatomy. There's lymphatic, urogenital, digestive, respiratory, connective tissue, nervous system, veins, arteries, muscles. It's pretty great. And it gives you definitions of all the, like those things like, what does that acetabulum mean? There's some finer definitions in there too. Okay, so we're looking at Leslie's question. What I'm suggesting is perhaps this is not as common with people. It's usually the opposite, especially with men. And men tend to have tighter hips in general. Is the inner part of the thigh here, or the inner part of the pelvis. All of this tends to be very like tight. Tight meaning weak, not strong. A strong muscle has the capacity to relax and engage on intentional command. So for those of your students, if you're a teacher, that are seated in Baddha Konasana with soles of feet together, their knees are like way up by their shoulders, this is really tight. And that's generally what's going on with people in yoga. So the solution for that is, again, look at the backside. How can I strengthen glute medius? And there's another muscle called tensor fascia lata. And that is on the outside of the hip. It's this one here. It's on the direct outside of the hip, and it blends into the iliotibial tract, like your IT band. It blends into that. So given there's some external rotation, what I'm suggesting for Leslie is that there's either some laxity of these muscles. Usually this isn't my recommendation for most people, but it might be to tighten a little bit of the inner, deeper muscles here. So Leslie, have you ever done forest core work with us before?
No. Mm-mm.
And others?
I have Cat Allen. I've taken Cat Allen's course, but not your guys.
Yeah. Kat would be a wonderful resource. In fact, she gave a talk on pre and postnatal and diastasis recti, one of our previous talks. But she would be a great resource to look at some of the deeper structures of the hip that you can look at engaging. Like for me, for example, and we have a friend, Sarah Gingrich, that I don't know if some of you may know. She was watching me practice. We were doing a little practice together with a group, and she was watching me practice, and she's like, "Your obturators are weak." And I was like, "Okay." Your obturators are weak. Like, that's a great eye. You can tell it's like a tiny muscle at the back of the hip that hooks onto the pelvis. And she's like, "Okay, here's what we can do to engage that smaller muscle." Kat would be a really great resource for that. And we can work with you too. So Forest, Megan, you'll definitely get a taste of this. Forest-based, I'm thinking of one specific practice. So forest-based core, you're lying on your back. Imagine this, you're lying on your back with your feet up to the sky, like legs up the wall, and you put a block in between your pelvis. And one of the details that gets missed in this core work, I won't explain it all, but one of the details that gets missed is femur bones internally rotate and gently squeeze. So internal rotation and gentle squeeze. That action for you could be a great way to train the inner thigh if it's that. We might have to have like a little movement session, meet up for a class or something.
And the block is in between the thighs?
It's in between the thighs, but it's as close to the pubic bone as possible.
Okay. Yeah, because it's really easy for me to, you know how people will lay on our back and we'll draw our legs. We have our legs stand out and we draw them up. My knees easily go down to the ground, and I feel like I said, when I'm sleeping, I naturally want to do that.
Mm.
So are you saying that it needs to be strengthened on the inside of the thigh? So I guess I'm just thinking that there's something with maybe it's too flexed or something, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. You said too flexed?
Well, yeah, I'm thinking that by strengthening that, are you suggesting that it would, I don't know, it would counteract wanting to draw the leg up, I guess, if that inside of my thighs, if that's strengthened, I guess.
And I want to be clear on what's actually happening, because I heard what I'm hearing is you have an external rotation of the femur bone, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So, again, looking at opposite, what could I do that's opposite? It's different than squeezing the knees together or squeezing the thighs together. It's a gentle squeeze of the thighs onto the block, and then it's a slight internal rotation. That internal rotation is the key. And you're imagining that as you internally rotate, this will help us get back to the bony structures, because I'm also tracking on, we have about 15 minutes left, is the bony structures. When we have ischial tuberosities here. Okay, so for those of you who can't see, I'm pointing to what are colloquially known as your sits bones. It's a made up word, right? Your sits bones are your ischial tuberosities. And if you imagine energetically, because there actually is a bit of movement here, energetically imagining your sits bones moving apart, opposite directions, and that internal rotation happening, then you may start to train the thigh to rotate inward. Because if the thigh is rotating outward, that whole line on the outer part of the leg, it's called the lateral fascial line. It starts up by your rib cage and goes all the way down to your ankle. That lateral line, if it's not strong and aligned, it will put a lot of pressure. It'll put torque pressure on your knee.
That's exactly what's happening. You hit it on the nail. I'm actually doing the movement now, and it's impacting it for sure.
And you're not even on camera. Look at that.
That's it. All right.
Good. That's
Thank
and
you.
look for. I'm happy that landed for you, because look for. This is for all of you. When you're working some specific thing to build strength, you can practice it in isolation, but watch in your practice where it shows up. And this is the thing that's going to totally change my movement practice, my life, is look for when it shows up when you're not on the mat. So if you normally stand like knock-kneed, or your toes turn way out or anything like that, mindfully move. I think it's so funny when people say, like, I don't have time to practice. Well, I can do a lot of the things in an elevator. We were on a longer flight, and I was doing like Utkatasana and working on shifting weight around in my hips when I was in the aisle standing up. So there's always time. There's always time. Okay, so let me jump back. I want to cover a couple of things before, and Leslie, I'm glad you got that. I'm going to cover a couple things, just general structure-wise, before we complete. So we've looked a lot at the posterior, the back part of the hip and the pelvis. Now let's look at the front. So we have pubic bone also, and pubic symphysis. There's actually a space in between. It's not a bony connection all the way through. So this is pelvis, and you want to get that pelvis is not the hip. It is attached to the hip. It's not in isolation the hip. So major joints, we have the hip joint itself, sacroiliac joint. Okay, we also have lumbar spine. And then if we look down, we have the knee joint. And then here's a quick rundown of some of the more important muscular structures. Okay, so you see this red one? This is psoas. Okay, so we have psoas. There's a fascial connection to the diaphragm, the respiratory diaphragm, and it goes all the way down. It covers across the hip and connects to the superior portion of the femur. And if I look underneath, see this muscle? It's like right in the groove of the ilium. That's iliacus. So this all weaves into one muscle down here. It's like one big cord. So that's psoas. And I want to finish with a muscle that's not here, but it's really, I think it's, maybe I'll cover two before we close. A couple things that are really important. Pelvic floor doesn't do it justice just to say pelvic floor, because it's pelvic floors. There's multiple different layers of muscle. So here's an interesting, simple way to start developing sensation inside of the pelvic floor. And I also acknowledge male pelvic floor, female pelvic floor are structurally, anatomically, they're different. But here's an interesting approach that totally shifted things for me. Is we have this thing, you feel like a broken record when we're in asana deep dive, because we're saying this over and over and over. You're standing in Tadasana. We say shift weight back into your heels, so the whole body drifts back, and then feel, it's an energetic movement, feel the heels reach apart. So you can say heels as in the heels of your feet, but if you look back to ischial tuberosities, these are the heels of your pelvis. So if you're seated, for example, in a meditation seat, Siddhasana, you can use that similar energy of the cue of reach your heels apart to say, reach your sits bones apart. Reach your ischial tuberosities apart. And as far as balance of the back body, the occiput bones, the back bones of your skull back here, they are the heels of your skull. And you want to stack heels of the skull over heels of the pelvis over heels of the feet. Reach heels of the feet apart, reach sits bones apart. The cranium's fused, so it's harder to reach those apart. Okay? And so we talked about pelvic floor. Here's the last muscular structure, myofascial structure, is the, which one is it? Piriformis. Has anyone ever heard of piriformis? Piriformis syndrome, anything like that? So this one's important. Fanya, I see you shaking your head. So piriformis connects to sacrum and to the greater trochanter. And it's called piriformis because it's shaped like a pear. It's thick at one end and thin at one end. So if you think of it going like this, right, over top. And this one is important because there are a couple different vascular neural bundles. They're just a fancy way of saying like there's vessels and there's nerve endings above and below and that go under it. So if piriformis is really tight, that's where you can get some compression on sciatic nerve. And there's some specific movements that we teach that, again, mobilize that muscle, strengthen the muscle, and leave it open so that you can reduce. We were working with a couple people this weekend who have a lot of sciatic pain, and we did these movements with them. And immediately they start to feel the effect of moving in the direction of less pain over time. The other thing that can happen with piriformis muscle is that some nerves can be embedded in the muscle. So when the muscle clamps down, they tweeze the nerve and start to cut the innervation of the nerve down to the leg. Maura, do you find it in your text?
I'm looking for it. I haven't found it yet.
Okay. Yeah. And we're just touching the surface. We didn't talk about adductors. We didn't talk about some of the deeper obturator muscles. You can go on forever. So this is, I always consider when I'm in this work, it's like I feel like I'm always starting. So before we complete, I do want to address a few of the other questions. And Ebony, I was interested in your question about when you said when I'm sitting with feet forward while sitting on the ground, and then you reach out quickly and you feel a zing. Can you describe that a little bit more? Like give us more of a picture of what that looks like.
It happens when I'm at my desk in my chair and I'll reach for something. I'll bend over. It's like in a cabinet and I'll reach under to the left and it's like a zing, but then I'll get up and I'll do the same motion, but I'll go slower and like position myself and like adjust myself and nothing hurts. So it's not like a just, oh, it hurts when I bend over. It's not that at all. Or if I'm sitting down and I bend over very quickly, then it like hurts. But if I take my time and adjust, then it doesn't.
Can you describe, is that zing, is it painful and is it localized?
It's painful.
Okay. And localized meaning like, does it show up in one spot over and over and over? Or is
Yeah.
it does, where?
In the hip, like in the middle though. And well, no, really it's like on the outer edge though of the hip, but like lower.
Left hip or right hip?
Left hip.
Always left hip?
Because I'm always reaching on that side usually.
Okay. And when you say outer hip, do you mean on the outside or do you mean on the very outside?
Yeah, like on the edges of it. Is it the edge?
Would you say it's more superficial or it's more deep, the pain?
I feel like it's superficial.
Okay. There could be some nerve compression going on. Does the pain travel at all?
No.
Okay, so it might not be nerve then.
Mm.
It could be a lot of things. I'm not gonna I probably won't be able to dial in. Again, some of this like you actually need to work with someone.
Right.
That's why we do private sessions and things like that. But it could also be getting into. So it's not in the joint. It's not in that piece.
Mm-mm. See, if I do it now, it won't do it.
Yeah. It's like when you're not paying attention. And I remember one time I reached down to pick up a sock from the floor and my low back, I was like, oh, are you kidding me?
Right.
Are you kidding me? It's when you're not present.
Yeah.
Okay. So it may be some of that tendon or ligament stuff going on too. Sometimes what can happen is you can feel and I'd have to get more specific and more defined on what you mean by zing, because that could be different for a lot of people. Right. Sometimes what happens when you move, I don't think it's this, but sometimes when you move, you can feel like a popping, and there's distinct and different pops. If it's a pop in the joint, not good. I mean, it's usually not a big deal, but it's like, I would rather that not happen. But if it's a pop in the connective tissue, like the fascia, then that can happen sometimes. It's like almost like feels like someone's playing guitar string on your, like your hamstrings or something like that.
Right.
Okay. So I think more research required on that.
Yeah.
And if you want to connect one-on-one too, we can do that and maybe, again, meet up at a class or something like that.
Okay.
And then there was another question before we close here. Anna, you had a question about yoga sequence. That one I think I'm going to create a video for later. And I'm always mindful of the like yoga sequences for things, because what I would rather say is focus on how you're moving. And here's one thing when you asked the question. So Anna, just to be clear, was asking, how long's your commute in LA?
It just depends, but there are definitely times when, I'm in the car for like an hour and 15 minutes randomly, or I'll have to drive like back and forth a lot throughout the day. So it feels like it's, it's like tightening the guitar strings in there.
Yeah. So looking at a couple things as far as just sequencing considerations, remember that tool of look at like what's happening and then what's the opposite action of that. When you sit in a bucket seat, typically car seats are designed like buckets so that you're in a really uncomfortable posterior tilt. Yes. I would look at a couple of things. There's a lot of things that are pretty unconventional that we can show you, where you're lying on your back with blocks under your back and you're engaging both the back line, so that's from the occiput bones of the skull all the way down the close lines of the spine, and then all the way down that back line to the hamstrings to the back of the heel. So what I'm saying is look at engaging the back line of the body. A really good one to do if you don't have any issues here is set up like bridge. So instead of bridge with feet flat, almost straighten your legs completely. The knees will be bent just a little. It's like you're laying flat. You've done that before.
Yeah.
And you lift your hips like 2 inches off of the ground. Right? And then there's some other general hip opening stuff I would do for you. But
I've been doing a lot of the like, there's no name for it, but the like kind of dog peeing on a fire hydrant, like opening, that stuff helps. And I love to torture my students with it too.
Like a leg abduction kind of thing.
Yeah.
Good. Well, it's 8:30 and I just want to hear from a few of you, 8:30 Central anyway. I'd love to hear from a few of you, like what you got out of this conversation. This is a launching point. So if you're like, I got 2 things and that's it, it's wonderful. And this is being recorded. You can come back to it. You can re-listen. We can connect on conversations. And then my intention with my tribe is also that a lot of the information that's being communicated in any of the things like the newsletter or Facebook, it's all interconnected. So there's this integration of information such that you see it. It's called Shuti method. Shuti method is you see it enough over and over and over and over. And then someone will come up to you, say if you're a teacher, and say, I have this thing where I feel a lot of pressure in my hip. And you'll just start answering them and say, well, if you put your hand here and you do this and you da-da-da, you'll be like, where did that come from? But you get exposure over and over and over. So I'd love to hear from a couple of you, like what you got or what you're hearing for yourself out of the conversation.
So for me personally, this is probably the first really hip anatomy lesson that I've gotten. So I'm very baseline with the terms, with the things that we've talked about, but it's definitely sparked an interest. And not only that, but just better preparing me for what's to come in our yoga teacher training. And I'm going to, as we've been talking, I've ordered the books that you've recommended. So I'm ready to dive in and learn more for sure.
Awesome. And you know, Megan, just know, I really want to acknowledge that you're like, this is where I am now. And like, you're putting things in place, structures in place to really step into your training in a powerful way. And just know that if you can start to like, I don't necessarily like this verbiage, but if you can start to just be with or wrap your head around some of the concepts, by the time you get to the training, it's like, we kind of like down level at the beginning of the training and then we ramp back up again. So you're just my intention is you're just going to walk in and go like, oh, this sounds familiar. Or like, I can kind of I see where we are now. It's like a ground to stand on.
Perfect. That's exciting. That's the main reason why I wanted to join tonight, not only for general hip health, but also to start that groundwork before I arrive in Troncones.
Awesome. Good. 1 or 2 more will you share?
I think for me, it's kind of the opposite. So this is stuff that we heard in our teacher training, but then I haven't really, that was like 1.5 years ago now.
Yeah.
It's wild, right? And so it's just really good. Like you said, I don't know what the word that you use, but at KIP we say like repeat to remember. So it's just really helped, like just, yeah. And then for me, just writing it down and then also like looking it up in the book. It was just helpful to hear it again.
Yeah. Nice.
Now that I have more like experience teaching, now that I can think about specific students that struggle with specific things. So yeah.
Awesome. Really great.
It was so enlightening for me, Dan, to hear the questions that you're asking and just to notice, like, is it painful? Is it localized? Like things like that to to start to work with students, especially when they maybe don't know necessarily what's going on and are just kind of like in it.
Yeah, I'm just hearing now that could actually be something that we formalize a little more. Because
yeah.
What I'll often do is at the beginning of a class, within the first 3 minutes, I can do a sweep assessment of really who's in the room, what bodies are in the room. And this is a great question to ask people, newer students especially, is we had a person in the program we led on the weekend and was like, this hurts. That's painful. Like this, that's painful. And I was like, well, is it painful or is it uncomfortable? She's like, it's just really uncomfortable. I'm like, but you don't have pain in any joints. Like hips okay, knees okay. She's like, no, it's all fine. And that was my sign to go, yeah, this is the practice. In many cases, it's really uncomfortable until it's not. And then when you get there, I'll just give you something to make it uncomfortable and you'll not like it for a while or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I really acknowledge that's what you heard for yourself, and start using it with your, there's a balance. I don't use it often because it can turn people off. It can, I never talk about anatomy usually with students who aren't anatomy interested. I talk in pretty simple terms, like in their language. So, well, that's everything. If I have a couple extra minutes, if anybody wants to stay on and talk more specific things, but I just really want to acknowledge each and every one of you. Some of you have been in this group for a little while, and some of you just signed up. And I really thank you so much for taking time out of your Wednesday night to be here. And it was so good to see and to hear some of you that I haven't seen or heard from in a while. So more to come. Next month, we have a really amazing person, Leslie, Lindsay Law. She lives out in California now, and she's going to lead a session on Himalayan pranayama. She works with one of our teachers, Swami Vidishananda, who's out there. I mean, he is a remarkable, I think he's human. And she's just a light in the world.
Dan, do you have a date for that yet?
I don't yet. She sent me an email today that I hope has the date, but I'll let everyone know as soon as we know. All right. Well, that's everything. Thanks, everyone. Like I said, I'll stay on if anyone has any questions or anything at all. If not, have a great night.
Thanks, Jen. Have a good night, everybody.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks
Bye.
again. Bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.